afternoon. My name is Michelle Carnes, and I am a senior advisor with the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System. I want to welcome you all to this wonderful lunch and learn opportunity that we have with REMI, discussing their economic impact modeling. This is a friendly reminder that this is being recorded and will be published to the CMTS YouTube channel. And with that, I am going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass it over to Peter so that you can introduce yourself and your team. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks everyone for attending. Actually, would it be possible for me to be able to share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to share it.
It's right now, it looks grayed out, unfortunately.
Oh no.
Apologies, I should have checked on that earlier.
Yeah, I should have too. Sorry.
Problem.
Yeah, it says if I hover over it, it says only meeting organizers and presenters can share.
Yes, try now, Peter.
Yes, looks good. I got it. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you.
No problem. No problem.
And it looks
Excellent.
good.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak with this group today. Thanks everyone for attending, and we hope to teach you something, and hope to be of help to you in the future. Just to introduce myself, Dr. Peter Evangelakis. I'm REMI's Senior Vice President of Economics and Consulting. And I'm joined by Celso Lopez, one of our economic assistants at REMI, who I'll let him introduce himself in just a second. But just to say off the top, we're going to be talking today about economic impact modeling, specifically using our REMI modeling software. And we'll discuss some previous studies that have used that, as well as a live demonstration, with some particular focus on inland waterways and similar types of transportation infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Celso to get us started, and then I'll return later in the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Celso Lopez, economic assistant at REMI. Thank you for that introduction, Peter. And Michelle, thank you for setting this up. And yeah, I'm excited to kind of tell you a little bit about what we do and how we use our economic impact modeling software for informed public policy making. So we've been the nation's leader for dynamic local, state, and national policy modeling for about 40 years now, founded in 1980 with the transformative idea of kind of forecasting the effects of various economic policies before they actually happen. So we're able to use our software to kind of shock the economy and show what those impacts are to various important indicators. And as you can see on the screen, we have some of our representative clients, including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Sandia National Labs, the Volpe Center at the US DOT, University of Michigan. And we can go over to the next slide, Peter. So these are the actual models that make up our suite of software. And PI Plus is kind of our flagship primary model. And essentially the way it works is if you have a certain policy or initiative in mind, you take something like PI Plus and you're able to shock the economy with your different with your policy that you have in mind. So that can be an infrastructure project. It can be change the tax code. And once you input that into the economy, you're able to simulate the shock to the economy and look at how that differs from the baseline. So essentially, how you're affecting the economy in the long term. Um, Now we have some modules as well that kind of build upon that PI Plus platform. So tax PI, for example, allows for additional tax fiscal revenue inputs into the model. So you can input the state um, budget, revenue policy, all that sort of thing, all those sorts of things into the model to forecast those additional components. And Transite is our transportation focused model, which again builds upon the PI plus kind of baseline. And that allows you to look at the effects of infrastructure projects and policies, and also has a suite of components for comparing projects like cost benefit analysis and specific transportation metrics like looking at the changes to VMT, vehicle miles traveled, improvements in safety, um, and a whole host of transportation specific variables. And E3 plus, that's our energy, environmental, and economy model. So that again expands on PI plus and adds certain capabilities for looking at energy specific policy. One of the major uses for the E3 model is looking at power plant production. So that's looking at um, the initial expenditures for building the power plant, the maintenance required, and then the employment that creates, and the changes to energy prices. Go next slide, please. So some of the key features of the REMI model that kind of distinguish us from other similar models and competitors is primarily, I would say, the most important kind of feature of the REMI model is the fact that it's a dynamic model. So that allows for time-based forecasting, year by year impacts. And right now with our current suite of models, we forecast out to 2060. And it also allows behavioral responses such as economic migration, for example. And then, of course, the R in the REMI name is regional, and that's because it's a multi-regional structure. So each model is custom built for our clients depending on their various needs, and we're able to build in the regions that they require, which can be broken out into counties, metros, states, or you can look at the whole of the U.S. on a national level. And then, of course, you can kind of pick and choose anything in between. So you can do a conglomeration of counties. You can do like a conglomeration of 3 counties, looking at one individual county and then looking at the rest of the state. And so you can shock those individual regions as well as look at the forecasted effects on those regions broken out in whichever way you desire. And then the economic linkages that make up the REMI model. So there's an input-output component. There's a CGE, computable general equilibrium component, and that allows labor, capital, and population shift responses to policy shocks, and that simulates real world rebalancing. So it's not a static economy when policy changes, when there's economic migration, when there are big changes to the economy, firms and policy and people on an individual level, they'll adjust to that new economy, and that's captured within the REMI model. And REMI is built on a peer-reviewed framework. So we've published methodologies in peer-reviewed journals, and we stem from academic foundations. REMI actually started at the University of Massachusetts, so we have academic roots in our core. And the REMI model and the equations are based on mainstream economic theory. And another thing I'll say to that is that, all our equations that we use in our REMI model, kind of the underlying processes that we use for our forecasting is all publicly available on our website. So it's open to scrutiny. Anybody can go and kind of see what makes up the REMI model, what equations we use, and how the model actually works. And this has all been true for about 45 years now. We started in 1980, so we have a lot of experience, and we've continued to refine the model for our clients' needs. So now I'll go over one of the studies that REMI has done. And this was one that I got the pleasure of working on and was really exciting for me. And this was done in conjunction with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it was looking at the economic effects of the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse and the associated port closure in Baltimore. So this was a very interesting scenario because we actually looked at 4 different scenarios. We looked at a business as usual scenario, so a fully functioning port and bridge. We looked at a partial bridge closure, so think like one lane is under construction on the bridge, so the bridge is still operational but at a reduced capacity. We looked at a partial bridge collapse, so that renders the bridge inoperable, but the port is still functioning. And then finally, we looked at the worst case scenario, which of course was the total bridge collapse and the associated port closure. So the inputs that we used in the REMI model to look at these different scenarios were the transportation costs, the increased transportation costs, the increased commuting costs, and the increased accessibility costs. And we looked at different time spans as well for these scenarios. So our key findings, what we found is that there was about a 4.9 billion GDP loss, including 1.3 billion alone in Maryland, with our worst case scenario with the full bridge collapse and port closure. And the employment and GDP recovery was delayed for years. So it took years to kind of come back to that baseline of where the economy would be otherwise without this scenario, without the bridge collapse. And of course, the commodity access was significantly reduced. And that kind of shows the bridge's role in the broader economic and supply chain network, which is really one of the beauties of the REMI model, how because it's all interconnected, we're able to look at those different components of the supply chain and how one shutdown of the supply chain or one hindrance in that process kind of has these large spanning effects, not just in the region, in the one region where the event takes place, but kind of how it cascades out into various regions. And we can go on to the next one, Peter. So this study, we looked at the analysis of the Po lock closure, and this was done with the Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis, where they used the REMI model to quantify the macroeconomic effects of a 6-month Po lock closure. And so this study really underscores kind of, again, the importance of resilient infrastructure and how critical single point failures are in industrial infrastructure. So the critical vulnerability with the Po lock closure is the iron mining kind of steel production manufacturing supply chain, which is vital to the U.S. economy. So we modeled the loss of iron ore transport in the Great Lakes and what those cascading effects look like. And what we found was up to 11 million U.S. job losses modeled from the supply chain collapse severe GDP contractions in the whole of the US, but especially in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, those regions most geographically close, but also with those industries that really rely on the steel and iron. And of course, the industries themselves, widespread industry shutdown in autos, appliances, construction equipment, rail cars. Within weeks, they come to basically a complete halt. Um, so what this report really emphasized is that there's no really single mitigation strategy sufficient to counteract disruption caused by such a closure, and how it's important to have a network of resilient infrastructure working in tandem.
Excellent. Thank you, Celso. So Peter here again. I'm going to talk a little bit in a little bit more detail about the model. There will be no quiz, don't worry. But just to get a little bit more of a detailed understanding of the model, and then I'm going to open up the model itself and do a live demonstration of a scenario where we see a disruption to the inland waterways. And one thing that I really want to emphasize, with the model being dynamic, as Celso mentioned, is that, not only are we able to look at impacts over time, but also, what happens in one year affects the next. So we're kind of capturing the kind of the dynamic kind of path dependence of the economy. And in this kind of schematic here, I want to elaborate a little bit on what Celso was discussing a couple slides ago with what are the economic linkages that kind of underlie how we model the economy. And we've broken that into a few different kind of major components that are kind of sketched out here that I'd like to talk about. Each of those components is represented in one of these kind of larger kind of beige boxes on the screen that may be a little bit hard to read, but and then there are kind of the white boxes within them are some of the representative kind of economic and demographic variables in the model. Obviously, there are many more in the model itself, but this is just meant to give you a good sense of what's going on. And so I'll just step through each of the components briefly and kind of talk about how they relate together and how they kind of work together to produce the kind of forecasts and kind of economic impact analysis. So the first box that's up at the top is called output and demand. And that's really a picture of the macroeconomy. And so as Celso mentioned, we can be looking at multiple different levels of geography. So whichever level of geography we're looking at, whether it's national or county level or state, we're able to see what is the kind of overall level of economic production, and that's kind of in total as well as by industry. We're also able to look at, for example, the level of GDP. So in the box here, we have some of the components of GDP, like consumption and investments, government spending, imports and exports as well. And then the rest of the boxes really kind of get into a little bit more of what's going on underneath the surface. So in the middle, there's the labor and capital demand box. That's really firms. So kind of businesses making decisions about how many people to hire and what kind of investments to make based on what is the cost of labor. How much do I have to pay my workers? How productive are my workers? What does it cost to to invest in capital, whether that's new buildings or equipment. And then kind of on the other side of things, we have a very detailed demographic. So if we look at the population and labor supply, we have a very detailed and fully integrated demographic component of the model. So we can look at single year of age by gender, by race, ethnicity category. So kind of cutting across all of those, we have 808 kind of demographic types, I guess, in the model. And we're able to look at the changes in population, that are driven by births and deaths, so what we would call natural changes, but also, as it's also alluded to earlier, economic migration, so people moving around based on responses to economic factors like where are kind of jobs relatively more available, where are jobs paying well, or taxes are low, or cost of living is low, things of that nature. Um, and then that's combined with labor force participation rates. So, how many people in certain cohorts are are participating in the labor force, are either working or looking for work, um, and even between those two kind of components, we see, okay, we have firms demanding workers, they need workers. Of course, on the population side, we have people in the labor force supplying their work. So, that's one of the many markets that we see in the model, the labor market. And so in the bottom box, we capture a lot of the costs and prices that show up in the economy. So one of those is, kind of the compensation rate or wages. And again, that's by industry. Um, but we also have that's one component of production costs. So production also requires, again, capital, so investments, as well as fuel and intermediate inputs. So all of those combine to feed into how costly is it to produce in a particular industry in a particular region. Um, and that's gonna itself have kind of a couple of different effects. One is that feeds down into the prices of the final goods. So if I am a manufacturer and my costs go up, then I'm likely to pass on at least some of that cost increase into higher prices down the line. And so as consumers are buying the products, they're seeing higher sticker prices. Um, we also have, for example, what is the cost of housing, and how is that driven by demand, kind of demand driven population flows. As more people move into an area, we're going to see increases in housing price as demand rises. Uh, so all of that is captured, and then on the other side of production costs, not only prices are affected, but also how competitive is a particular industry in a particular region. If my costs are rising, if I'm a manufacturer in say the Midwest, and my suppliers see a bigger shock than maybe suppliers to manufacturers elsewhere, I'm going to be at a disadvantage because now, my costs are higher than maybe some of my competitors had been. And so, that may, operate through a few different channels. But in general, that's going to lead to, maybe less production, and maybe a rebalancing geographically of where that production is happening. So that's kind of a big picture of what the model is doing. And then I do want to highlight um, uh, kind of kind of maybe do a double click on some of the economic geography pieces, that we mentioned a little bit earlier, and Celso was discussing again those economic linkages, and how essentially how moving goods around a transportation network, can feed into impacts on the real economy. So Celso, in discussing one of the projects that we've done, talked about transportation costs, accessibility costs, and commuting costs. So those really strike at the heart, especially in our transite model, of the kind of how you go from changes to the transportation network to changes in the real economy. So I'll start with accessibility costs. Those are referring to access to intermediate inputs. So, for example, if I'm a car maker, I'm going to need, say, steel and aluminum. I'm going to need car parts, et cetera, to be able to build. And so, if it's, as we saw in the, POWOC study, if it's more difficult to get iron or, steel, that's going to have a major impact on raising my input costs. And making it more costly for me to produce. And again, that's going to have impacts not only on prices down the line, but maybe how competitive in the case of a car manufacturer, maybe domestic manufacturers in general maybe are disadvantaged relative to foreign manufacturers, as just as an example. There's also transportation costs. Those are reflective of transporting final goods to consumers. So kind of the other side, once I've gotten my intermediate inputs and I'm producing, say, cars or washing machines or whatever it is, how costly is it to then transport the finished products to consumers? And again, that can feed into higher production costs and higher prices down the line. There's another component, commuting costs. It's not going to be as relevant for our demonstration here, because really we're going to be talking about transportation of goods. But commuting costs, especially if we're looking at highway networks, road networks, for example, how costly is it for people to get to work? And really what that's going to affect is, what kind of access do firms have to workers? If it's really easy to commute, if it's quick to, to get around, there's kind of geographically kind of a wider range. Maybe if I'm say a manufacturer, and I'm trying to hire, maybe if it's easier, faster commuting, there's geographically a wider swath of people, of the labor force that I have access to. And so in general, that's going to allow kind of better matches, find better workers. And so that can have impact on kind of how productive the workers are. And that also feeds into costs as well. And so those are some of the items that are kind of captured here. The commodity access index, that feeds into kind of intermediate inputs and how costly the inputs are in general. Kind of labor access and how productive workers are, and kind of in general transportation costs feeding into production costs and prices down the line. So now I want to introduce what I'll be showing you live in the model, just to kind of set some context, and then I'll go over to that. So we're going to look at a hypothetical kind of stylized scenario where we have the economic impacts of a disruption to inland waterways. And here, we have a model that has, the Houston MSA and the rest of the US. And so we're looking at, what if there's a disruption? And here it may, I think maybe not a total disruption, although we certainly could look at that as well, as we discussed with the bridge collapse study. Here, I think you can think of this more as maybe a partial disruption. And what I'm going to do to simplify this kind of counterfactual is, let's look at a disruption to the waterways where kind of water transportation is at least partially substituted by kind of rail transportation of the same goods. We can also do the same thing with truck transportation in certain cases, or potentially air transportation. Although truck and rail are generally the kind of the most one-to-one, kind of substitutes. Air transportation is a little bit different in the amount that it can carry efficiently. But basically, for our purposes here, I'm just gonna do a one-to-one and say, waterways are disrupted to some degree. There's less flow of goods on the waterways, and more of that is taken through the rail network. So that's going to have a few different effects. So the first two bullets are kind of related to each other. The first is there'll be a decrease in the revenue for the water transportation industry, right? So kind of the barges and all of that, kind of all of that transportation infrastructure on the waterways, they're going to be hauling less, and so they'll be earning less, and so that'll be a decrease in revenue in that industry. And kind of on the flip side, rail transportation will see an increase in revenue as it hauls more. And I'll note importantly here, generally rail transportation, it comes at a higher cost than water transportation. And so we have put in an increase in revenue in rail transportation that's that's higher in size than the decrease in water transportation revenue. So kind of on net, if you're just looking kind of across these two, industries, water and rail transportation kind of combined, there's an increase in revenue. But obviously, you have the rail transportation is kind of the proximate winner, and water transportation is kind of the proximate loser in that scenario. But I think the much bigger picture is that because rail transportation is generally a costlier mode of transporting goods, you are going to see an increase in the cost of transporting intermediate and final goods. And so again, the intermediate goods transportation, that's related to that accessibility cost that I was discussing, and transporting final goods, that's related to that transportation cost that I discussed. Apologies, transportation cost in this context has a specific meaning, although does sound like a more general concept. But here it's related to final goods transportation. And so both of those are going to have impacts on, again, kind of competitiveness of the industries, and maybe in this case of the U.S. To some degree, as well as impacts to some degree on prices. Again, it's a partial disruption, and kind of we're looking at a national picture, so it won't be massive in terms of kind of the price shock. There will be some increase, but really what we're going to see is the industries become less competitive because their transportation costs rise, and they're not as able to compete, especially in the world market. So with that, I'm going to jump out of here and into the model. So here we have one of our transite models, as we talked about. That's the transportation kind of focused model of ours. All of our models have the same core capabilities that that PI Plus model that's also described have, but then of course add on additional functionality. Here we have a variety of ways of looking at what are the impacts on the transportation network, and how does that feed into the economy, again through those, especially through those cost metrics. But we can also, for example, if we have many state departments of transportation as clients, a lot of them will have travel demand models that they use. Again, this is more in the context of roads and highways, but the model can feed in the results coming out of a travel demand model, and incorporate that into what are the changes in costs, changes in safety, emissions, and a variety of other factors. So before I go into the simulation itself, I'll just briefly talk about what we call the control forecast, which here is really, you can think of that as the baseline, kind of the business as usual forecast for the economy. If there's no disruption, there's no policy change, we're just thinking, what's going to happen going forward if things are just kind of on track. And then we'll look at that disruption scenario, and I'll kind of look at kind of two layers of that disruption scenario. One, just looking kind of in isolation at the industries themselves, and then layering in the kind of the biggest picture effect, which is the increase in transportation, in the cost of transporting intermediate and final goods. So again, just to briefly talk about the control forecast, here we have a national model. So this is looking at a forecast of the whole US. We can also here look at kind of components of that. So for example, again, in this model, we're looking at the Houston region as kind of the specific region in the model. So we can look at that as well, or kind of the rest of US kind of aggregated region. So we always land on the economic summary whenever we open up either a control forecast or the results of the simulation. We land here. This is kind of a dashboard. And again, apologies if you can't read it too well. Don't worry too much about the specific numbers here. I'll kind of guide you through it. But basically, again, this is a dashboard. This has, for example, total employment, population, GDP, personal income, and several other variables, and often the ones that are of most interest to policymakers and decision makers And again, we have that forecast. It goes all the way out. I'll scroll just quickly here, just so you can see, scroll all the way out to 2060. So it's a fairly long-term forecast, about 35 years or so. And then we can look, under the hood a little bit, in actually a lot, in quite a bit more detail. I certainly won't dig into all of that now because we could spend a lot of time on that. But just to give you a sense of some of the other kind of more detailed metrics that we can look at. So first, I'm just going to show, if we look at employment, we can look at employment not just at a top line, but if we can look at it industry by industry. And so we can see here at the top line, and maybe I'll just open up the Houston one again. The top line here, the all industries kind of aggregates up, and this is the same number that you saw or that you would have seen in the economic summary table. So this is kind of the top line number, but then it breaks it out by all of these. Here we have a version of the model that has 70 sectors, which is roughly at the 3-digit level of detail for the North American Industrial Classification System, or the NAICS code. And we also have models at the 2-digit kind of sectoral, kind of high-level aggregated level, as well as a more detailed version, 160 sectors, that has it's at the 4-digit NAICS code level, so has a lot more detail. For example, even more detail in manufacturing and energy and several other industries. But regardless, you can see here, if we scroll down again, I'll scroll quickly. You can see kind of all of the industries kind of breaking out, where where that employment is distributed across industries. And then I just want to show, since it'll be important here, I'm going to do this industry price profile. Actually, in this case, going to add a few more decimal places here for more, more of a big picture. And I'll go again to Houston so we can see. So there's a lot going on in this table. Again, I'm not going to, quiz you on it or anything, but just to give a sense, we have here kind of what is the relative cost to businesses. So what I have highlighted is the overall cost of production relative to the U.S. as a whole. So for the Houston MSA, we see, generally speaking, at least across all industries, kind of aggregated together, we see, maybe 12 or 13% kind of below, costs are a little bit below the national average. But then we can see, for example, where does that come from? The cost of, the cost of labor is, much closer to the national average. The cost of capital is much closer to the national average. But then the cost of fuel, about 20% below the national average, and the cost of inputs, about 15% below the national average. So you can see, the kind of the different components of costs. And again, the reason that I'm, highlighting this here is, when we're looking at the simulation that I'm about to show you, the key factor is going to be accessibility costs, driving input costs, and transportation costs driving production costs, and what we call delivered price. And so those are going to be kind of the main mechanisms where we're going to see costs rising, really having a pretty strong negative impact. All right, so let me move from this kind of baseline kind of control forecast, business as usual, to the disruption scenario itself. And so I'm just going to go, first of all, I'll just note, there's this select inputs screen here. We're able to search, just by way of kind of one practicality here, you're able to search in accessibility, for example. We can go into the accessibility costs. We call our model inputs policy variables, so that's what that means here. And then you have a number of suggestions. Some of these are trans-site specific. For example, the travel demand module that I alluded to earlier, as well as some other kind of transportation focused items. And then, of course, kind of your history. So You can see here the drivers of the simulation that I'm about to show you. So in the inputs list here, so this is the list of model inputs. So right now I have run, I'll just introduce the first, and then I'll come back and introduce the others. So the first is, again, that decrease in water transportation revenue and the increase in rail transportation revenue. And we've done that for each of them, for Houston area and for rest of US. So kind of going in both directions on that transport line. Um, and here, essentially, the decrease in water transportation revenue is more than compensated by the increase in rail transportation revenue. As I kind of talked about, rail transportation is at least on average, it's costlier to transport the same goods on rail, so the revenue here is higher. So I've already run this scenario, so I'm just going to go to the results, but the forecast options here, you're able to run the forecast. I've run it out for about 10 years. Again, you can run it out longer than that, but just for kind of ease and kind of efficiency of the demonstration, I've just run it out for 10 years. And if we look at the results, again, we're going to land back at that economic summary table, that dashboard. And again, not surprisingly, if we just look kind of at the narrow, isolated fact that there's kind of a net increase in revenue because rail transportation earns more to haul the same goods than water transportation. We do see here an overall positive. We see all of the plus signs. We see an overall positive impact on for example, employment, on economic output or GDP, on personal income. So people, for example, more people are being employed, more people are earning income. The output is kind of a measure of that revenue, especially. But just one important note here is that we're not just capturing kind of the narrow impact of that the kind of that revenue differential between the two transportation sectors. We're not just capturing those direct effects on revenue. We're capturing how did those spill out across the economy. So if you think back to the kind of the schematic that I showed you before, all of the interrelationships. You have the jobs and people in the jobs earning income. That income is spent through kind of, so that contributes to consumption. That consumption creates demand. It creates demand for retailers who are selling the product. It creates demand for the manufacturers who are making the product. And then you also have for the industries that are directly impacted, as their revenue is going up, they're calling on their supply chain for they're increasing demand for their supply chain. That's also generating jobs and economic output. We also have with all of these kind of positive impacts on employment and economic activity. That's generally going to lead to increased investment activity. If I'm hiring more, maybe I need to install more equipment, or I need to expand my kind of the footprint of my building to accommodate more staffing. And so there are all of these different impacts that we can see, and we can kind of capture that if we look in this kind of economic table section where we're digging a little bit more into the details. And we can, if we again look at employment by industry, and I'm just going to look here kind of an arbitrary year, and I'm going to sort. So we're going to see, of course, positive impacts for rail transportation. That's kind of direct positive effect. But we also see impacts on construction activity. That's that investment activity that's generated. Professional services and administrative support services. Real estate, wholesale trade. All of those are big supply chain industries, and they're positively impacted. We also see things like retail trade, food services and drinking places. that are also, that also benefit from, in this case, from, people spending more, with that increase in income. So we really see kind of a, kind of a holistic picture here, at least of this component of the analysis. But and this will be the last part, because I'm looking at the time now, and I do want to leave a little bit of time for any Q&A. The most important part of this analysis is the increase in accessibility and transportation costs. And again, this will be kind of going in both directions. So here, these are kind of directional. So we have, kind of, between Houston and the rest of the U.S., et cetera, and the rest of the U.S. and Houston. And so if we look at what are the impacts of that, so I'm just going to activate those model inputs or those policy variables. I'll let this run, and then we'll see what the impacts of that is. So I've left in the kind of effects on revenue for those particular transportation sectors, the water and rail. But now we're going to see, much more widespread impacts, kind of negative impact from the increased cost of transporting goods. That comes along with this waterways disruption. So I'm going to go back here to the economic summary table, and we can see, instead of a small positive, impact of maybe, a couple thousand jobs increase, we see, it kind of builds up a little bit over time. And again, that's part of the dynamic nature of the model. We're capturing kind of the dynamics of businesses responding to changing costs. And, but, as we kind of see, over the course of the last, maybe, 5 or 6 years of this study period, we see, maybe close to 200,000 jobs being, not necessarily lost. Some of these jobs may be lost, but some of them may just be, jobs that would have been created in the kind of baseline, kind of world, where now maybe there's a slowdown, and so maybe hiring slows down. But regardless, we see this, big negative economic impact. And again, that's going to be driven by, businesses being a lot less competitive. We have, this will be, for example, the accessibility cost impact. That's going to be, higher costs for, say, this is not just a manufacturing story, but I think it's kind of the easiest example to wrap your head around, and especially given the context of, the transportation system. Manufacturers seeing higher prices and, having a harder time competing against, potentially, domestic producers in other parts of the country that aren't affected by the inland waterways disruption, and certainly, relative to maybe foreign producers. So again, maybe that they go out of business, and maybe that they're just able to sell less, to, kind of, they lose maybe some of their more price sensitive customers. It could be a variety of factors, but you're seeing kind of, kind of a widespread impact, from this kind of widespread cost increase. And so again, if we, we'll look here, we can see, kind of across a whole variety of industries being impacted significantly. We see some of the same kind of big picture industries that we saw before with, construction, retail, healthcare, and the like. But, we even see things like, financial, social assistance impacts, kind of on a wider variety, as, we see kind of a wider base of impact, and that feeds, across, my costs are going up, I'm spending less, across the board. If I'm spending, I may be, if, costs are higher for me, I may be spending less on a whole variety of things, on goods and services. And so there's also the price effect of, not only are businesses less competitive, people are paying higher prices, and so that also drives demand down. And so again, as we saw before, this kind of underscores, just to go back to the big picture and kind of wrap it up here, is, if there's a disruption to the infrastructure, it has real and very widespread negative impacts. Here we looked at a small to medium sized disruption, and we see pretty significant job loss, income loss, and this something that we've looked at a lot with REMI is what is the value of resilience? Well, if you can minimize these types of disruptions or mitigate them once they happen, there's real value in doing that. So with that, I'll pause and allow for questions in the last few minutes here.
Peter, it's also, oh my goodness, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely wonderful. We do have a few questions and then that I will go ahead and ask that were put into the chat. And then I also see that we have a hand raised. But I also want to note that we are nearing 2 o'clock. I don't have to leave right away. Peter, Celso, how are you guys on time? Do you have a heart out?
I unfortunately I do have a
Okay.
claim, but
Okay.
but
Great.
we
Let's.
are happy to if there are any questions that come up after or any ones that we can't get to right now, that we're happy to answer those. Be put in touch. We have our emails here.
Perfect. Okay, great. So the first question was, do you consider if cargo will be rerouted? And that question came about specifically when you were talking about um, the FSK study that you guys did. Did you consider rerouting, or is it something that could be considered in your modeling?
Yes, it certainly can be, and I'm forgetting now the details, and I know Celso is I think a little bit more involved working with some of our U.S. Army Corps partners, but certainly that can be, and I think that's part of what I was doing in the live demo too was essentially this kind of idea of rerouting, and here
Mhm.
it's a higher cost rerouting, and so that'll feed into some of the increased transportation or accessibility costs that we were talking about.
Right. Okay, great. A very important question, especially from our Bureau of Transportation Statistics people, as how do you validate the model?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, of course, as Celso mentioned, we have kind of the long history and kind of that kind of academic background. So there is a lot of peer review, kind of the methodology is based on peer review. All of that's documented. Um, and one thing that we've done, there have been a few kind of a few looks at validating the model over the years. It is a bit tricky to do, especially with a simulation scenario, because kind of being able to see what is after the fact, what was the impact of something, even a fairly major event or policy may be swamped by just the overall size of the economy. One area where I think that was mitigated to some degree, and we did get a before and after, was with Hurricane Katrina. So actually, Sandia National Labs did kind of a pre-study, in the days before the hurricane was about to hit, and then there was a study done, ex post, and the idea there was to look at what is the correlation between what was forecasted and what actually played out. And there was a pretty high correlation, I think, at least I think an R squared kind of statistic, or, roughly speaking, kind of the square of the correlation coefficient of, over 0.9, so about, 90% plus. And I think there it's a little bit easier to draw inference just because that was such a major, event in that region. And then there have been studies. I'm happy to share. Looking at kind of baseline forecasts and what those kind of how those compare ex post. So happy to share more information about that after.
Yeah, that'd be great. I know our members would be happy to read up and look into anything that can be shared. Um, I see we have 2 minutes left, and no offense to those who have typed in some questions. We will get to those, but Corey, I have allowed you to speak. So if you would like to unmic and ask your question, we'll go ahead and take Corey's question.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you very much, Peter, for walking us through all of this. I actually just put my question into the chat as well. Kind of noting that in LA alone next week, they're expecting a 35% reduction in cargo volumes. And obviously it's likely to increase going forward. And that's just LA. Needless to say, Long Beach, Seattle, Tacoma are facing drastic declines in the short term. Wondering if this model can crunch the numbers and come up with what the costs are associated with such a dramatic decline in cargo volumes.
Yeah, certainly, and obviously this is largely related to tariffs. So we've done a number of studies. Actually, we have a policy variable in the model called foreign import costs. That captures kind of both the kind of protectionists part of kind of protecting a certain industry that's where the import costs are higher, as well as maybe the cost increases that are associated, and that will feed down the line. So we've done studies, and actually we did REMI. We hosted a webinar recently. It wasn't our first, but looking at impacts of tariffs. So happy to share that as well. But certainly with regards to cargo volume specifically, we can certainly look at something like things like the support activities for transportation. I think that's where kind of ports fall in. So we could certainly look at impacts on kind of the ports directly, as well as the associated, again, costs of having less access to goods and how that affects prices. So yeah, all of those types of factors can certainly be captured in the model. And apologies, I do have to run, but Michelle, please feel free to pass along the other questions, and we're happy to share our slides. It'll have our emails, but please feel free to pass along the questions to us as well. We want to make sure everybody's get addressed. I always talk more than I think, so less time for the live Q&A, but happy to connect with folks after.
It's easy to do when you're great at what you do and you're passionate about it. So Peter and Celso, thank you guys again so much for being here with us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and I'll be in touch with you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And thank you everyone for joining. Please feel free to reach out